There is a period at the end of that message that was not placed there by accident. It was placed there by a nervous system. A nervous system that was terrified of being misread. Every day, the average person sends dozens of text messages without a single conscious thought about what those messages are actually communicating. The words, yes, but not the punctuation, not the timing, not the deliberate choice to use lowercase when they know how to capitalize, not the 3 seconds they spent typing and then deleting before they finally hit send. And here's what nobody ever told you. Not your parents, not your teachers, not a single class, a single lesson, a single conversation ever sat you down and said, the way you communicate digitally is being read, decoded, and judged by everyone around you every single day. You were handed a grenade and called it a phone. You were expected to figure it out alone, in real time, with real consequences. That is not an accident of education. That is a gap so wide it has quietly shaped your relationships, your career, your sense of self-worth. And nobody ever thought to warn you. Because here is what behavioral science has quietly confirmed over the last decade. The way you text is not a neutral act. It is a psychological fingerprint, a live broadcast of your insecurities, your social positioning, your fear, and your hunger for connection, transmitted in real time to anyone who knows how to read it. The people who understand this have an advantage over you, a silent one. They read your hesitation in a delayed reply. They hear your anxiety in an over-explained message. They feel your need for approval in every exclamation point you added just to make sure you didn't seem cold. And you never even knew the game was being played. You think you are having one conversation. You are having two. This is the science behind texting, the language nobody taught you, the rules nobody told you existed. By the time this is over, you will never read a message the same way again. Language has always had a grammar, a set of rules that governs meaning, hierarchy, and intent. But for most of human history, those rules were stable, agreed upon, taught in classrooms, reinforced by institutions, passed down through generations. Then, the smartphone arrived, and in less than 2 decades, an entirely new grammar emerged, one that nobody wrote down, nobody agreed upon, and nobody teaches. A grammar not of correctness, but of signal, of status, of power. And the first rule of this new grammar is one of the most psychologically loaded developments in the history of human communication: the period. In formal writing, a period is invisible. It is expected. It carries no emotional weight. But in the context of a casual text message, a medium that evolved without punctuation, that breathed and moved in fragments and ellipses and run-on sentences, a period does something entirely different. It lands, it closes, it cuts. Psychologists and linguists studying digital communication have documented what most people already feel instinctively. A period at the end of a casual text message signals displeasure, distance, or deliberate desire to end the conversation. It does not say I am following the rules of grammar. It says, I am done with you right now. And the recipient's nervous system registers that distinction without a single conscious thought. But the period is only the beginning. Look at the way people choose to write in lowercase. Not because they forgot to capitalize, not because they are careless, but because in the silent social contract of digital communication, lowercase has come to signal something specific and carefully constructed, a studied nonchalance, a performance of effortlessness. It says I am so unbothered by this interaction that I cannot even be troubled to hold the shift key. And it is almost always deliberate. Research into digital self-presentation shows that people who consistently use lowercase in casual communication are often highly socially aware, more so, in many cases, than their formal counterparts. The lowercase is not laziness. It is labor, It is the careful curation of an image that says, "I am relaxed," precisely because they are not. And then there is the exclamation point, once a mark of genuine enthusiasm, of surprise, of celebration. Now something else entirely. Studies on digital tone perception reveal a striking pattern. In professional and social texting, the exclamation point has become less a marker of excitement and more a defensive tool, a preemptive shield against being misread as cold, distant, or aggressive. "Sounds great!" exclamation mark does not mean the sender is thrilled. It means the sender is anxious. It means they have learned through painful social trial and error that "sounds great," period, with that same period, reads as hostile to the modern eye. The exclamation point inflation is not enthusiasm. It is an armor. This is the grammar of status, the invisible rulebook that everyone is playing by and nobody was ever handed. And the cruelest part of it, the part that should make you genuinely angry, is that you have been judged by these rules your entire digital life. Evaluated, measured, found warm or cold, confident or anxious, powerful or desperate, all based on punctuation choices you were never told carried any weight at all. Every message you have ever sent has been read this way, by colleagues, by romantic partners, by friends, by strangers, and nobody ever told you. Time is not neutral. It never has been. In every human culture across recorded history, the person who controls time controls the relationship. The king does not wait. The supplicant does. The employer schedules the meeting. The employee arrives early. The object of desire takes their time responding. The desperate one replies instantly. We have always known this, somewhere deep in the architecture of our social instincts. But we never had a tool that made the power dynamic so visible, so measurable, so impossible to ignore. Until the read receipt. The read receipt may be the single most psychologically volatile feature ever introduced into human communication. In one stroke, it transformed response latency, the time between receiving a message and replying to it, from an ambiguous social signal into a documented fact. You can no longer claim you didn't see it. The evidence is there, time-stamped, irrefutable. And what followed was something social psychologists had never quite seen before, the deliberate weaponization of visibility. To leave someone on read is to make a statement without saying a word. It communicates hierarchy. It communicates availability, or the deliberate performance of unavailability. In romantic contexts, researchers studying modern dating behavior have found that response latency is now one of the primary metrics by which people unconsciously assess their own value to another person. A fast reply feels like warmth. A slow one feels like a verdict. But the truth is more complicated and more unsettling, because then there are the three dots. That small animated ellipsis, the typing indicator, has become one of the most anxiety-inducing features in the history of human design technology. And nobody designed it to be that way. It was meant to be helpful, considerate, a small courtesy that said, "I am here, I am responding, please wait." Instead, it became a window into the most vulnerable moment in any digital exchange, the moment before the words are chosen, the moment of editing, of second-guessing, of self-censorship. When those three dots appear and then disappear without a message, the recipient is left with one of the most destabilizing questions in modern social life. What were they going to say? And why did they decide not to say it? The anxiety that question produces is not irrational. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. Scanning for social threat, reading the environment for signals of rejection or acceptance, trying to determine whether the tribe is still warm or whether the cold is coming. And then there is the shift that the most socially powerful communicators have quietly made. The move from instant replies to intentional batch responding, from being available to performing unavailability, from reacting to orchestrating. In professional contexts, researchers studying workplace communication dynamics have documented a consistent pattern. Individuals who respond to messages on a defined schedule rather than immediately are perceived as more authoritative, more in demand, and more valuable than those who reply instantly. The instant reply, for all its warmth, signals something the social brain reads as low status. It says, "I was waiting. I had nothing more important to do. You are my priority." And in a culture that equates busyness with worth, that is a dangerous message to send. This is the temporal power play. The silent negotiation is happening in the space between send and reply. A negotiation with real stakes, emotional, professional, romantic, that you have been participating in your entire digital life. Without a single lesson, without a single warning, without even knowing there was a game to be played.
We've just looked at the mechanics, the grammar, the timing. And if you're anything like me, somewhere in the last few minutes, you started doing something you probably can't stop now. You started going back through your threads, back through the conversations you've had this week, this month, this year, looking at them differently, noticing things you never noticed before. The period someone left at the end of a message you thought was fine. The reply that used to take 4 minutes now takes 4 hours. The 3 dots that appeared and then disappeared and never became anything. You're recalculating, and that recalculation is uncomfortable because it means that the signals were always there. You just didn't have the language for them yet. But here's what I want you to hold on to before we go deeper. Understanding this doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you literate. There is a difference between reading a room with anxiety and reading a room with clarity. One is fear. The other is knowledge. And what we're about to get into, the visual layer, the emotional layer, the part of digital communication that operates almost entirely below the surface of conscious thought, that's where it gets really interesting. Because it turns out, the most revealing thing you can do in a text conversation has nothing to do with words at all.
There is an entire economy of emotional investment happening inside your message threads right now. And like most economies, it is deeply, quietly unequal. It operates not in words, but in reactions. In the emoji, someone chooses or doesn't choose. In the speed with which they acknowledge what you said, in the gap between what you offered and what you received in return. And most people feel this economy viscerally, in the chest, in the stomach, without ever being able to name what is actually happening. So let's name it. When researchers began studying emoji use in digital communication, they expected to find relatively arbitrary variation, personal preference, generational difference, platform habit. What they found instead was a consistent and surprisingly precise hierarchy of perceived emotional investment. And at the center of that hierarchy sat 2 reactions that most people already know, on some level, are not equivalent. The heart and the thumbs up. The heart says, "I was moved by what you said. I received it. It landed." It requires a moment of genuine emotional registration, however small, before the finger reaches for it. The thumbs up says something else entirely. It says, "I have acknowledged your message and I am now moving on." It is the digital equivalent of a nod from across a crowded room. Technically responsive, emotionally absent. And the person who sent that carefully written paragraph felt that distinction. They felt it before they could explain it. Because the social brain does not need an explanation. It keeps score automatically. But nothing in the visual architecture of modern messaging carries more psychological weight than the read receipt. We touched on it in the context of time. Now look at it through the lens of power, The decision to enable read receipts or disable them is one of the most telling meta-communications a person can make about how they intend to operate in their relationships. To have them on is a gesture of transparency, of accountability, of "I will not hide from you." To have them off is a boundary, yes, but in certain contexts, it is also a shield, a way of preserving optionality, of never being caught waiting, never being caught available, never giving anyone the satisfaction of knowing they were seen and deliberately not answered. And then there are the people who have read receipts on and leave messages unread anyway, who open a notification in the pull-down without triggering the receipt, who have learned to game the system so thoroughly that the system no longer tells the truth. These are not small behaviors. They are the behavioral signature of people who have learned, consciously or not, that visibility is vulnerability, that to be seen is to be known, and to be known is to be held accountable. And then there is the voice note. In a landscape of carefully edited, endlessly revisable text, the voice note is an anomaly. It cannot be spell-checked. It cannot be restructured after the fact. It cannot hide behind the safety of chosen words and considered punctuation. It arrives raw, breathing, stumbling, alive, carrying everything the sender could not quite control. The pause before a difficult sentence, the slight shift in tone when the real point finally arrives, the laugh that comes out nervous when it was meant to come out casual. Communication researchers studying the rise of voice messaging have found something striking. People who send voice notes in close relationships are not simply choosing a more convenient format. They are making a vulnerability play. Consciously or not, they are saying, "I am willing to let you hear me, not just read me." And the recipient, whether they realize it or not, receives that offer as exactly what it is, which is why an unplayed voice note carries a specific kind of weight that an unread text message does not. The text could have been skimmed, but a voice note requires presence. It requires you to stop and listen and receive another human being in real time. To leave it unplayed is not just to delay a reply. It is to decline an intimacy. And most people have done exactly that to someone and had it done to them. This is the visual layer of digital communication, the layer that operates almost entirely without words. And it is, in many ways, the most honest layer of all, because it is the hardest to consciously control. You can choose your words carefully. You can edit your sentences until they say exactly what you want them to say and nothing more. But the reaction you reached for, the receipt you left unacknowledged, the voice note you never played, those tell a different story. And that story has been running in the background of every relationship you have ever had through a screen. Nobody handed you the decoder. Until now. There is a word that appears more than almost any other in the text messages of people who are anxious about how they are perceived. It is 4 letters long. I just wanted to check in. Just a quick question. Just following up. On the surface, it sounds humble, considerate, undemanding. But behavioral linguists studying patterns of digital self-expression have identified what that word is actually doing in sentences like these. And it is not what the sender consciously intends. Just is a minimizer, a preemptive apology, a signal that says, "I already know I am asking for too much, so I am making myself smaller before you have the chance to make me feel that way." It is the linguistic equivalent of shrinking in a doorway, and the people who use it most are almost never the ones who should be apologizing for taking up space. But the minimizer is only one instrument in the orchestra of digital anxiety. The other is the over-explanation. You know it when you see it. The message that should have been 2 sentences and became 6. The reply that answers not just the question that was asked, but the 3 questions that might theoretically follow. The explanation that explains itself, then explains why it needed to explain itself, then closes with a softener just to make sure none of it landed wrong. Psychologists studying written self-disclosure patterns have found a consistent correlation. The length and density of an unsolicited explanation is almost directly proportional to the sender's underlying need for external validation. The over-explainer is not providing information. They are seeking absolution. They are trying to preempt judgment by making their intentions so transparent, so thoroughly documented, that disapproval becomes impossible. It never works. And somewhere, they already know that. And then there is the fragmented sender, where the composed communicator sends one considered message, a single block of text, structured, complete. The fragmented sender fires in bursts. One thought, send. Another thought, send. A correction to the first thought, send. An addition to the correction, send. To the recipient, this pattern can feel energetic, spontaneous, even endearing. But communication researchers studying message fragmentation have identified something more revealing underneath it. A frantic quality, a mind moving faster than it can organize itself, thoughts arriving with an urgency that does not allow for the pause that assembly requires. The fragmented sender is not being casual. They are being uncontained. And in high-stakes conversations, in conflict, in confession, in the early stages of a relationship, that lack of containment is one of the most unguarded things a person can reveal about themselves through a screen. But of all the anxiety-driven behaviors that manifest in digital syntax, perhaps the most quietly fascinating is mirroring. Watch what happens in a conversation between two people who want each other's approval. Over the course of a thread, sometimes within minutes, one begins to subtly adopt the linguistic patterns of the other. The slang, the abbreviations, the specific punctuation habits, the emoji vocabulary. It is not a conscious decision. It is the social brain executing one of its oldest survival programs. Become more like the person you need to accept you, and the chances of rejection decrease. Mirroring in face-to-face communication has been studied extensively. The way people unconsciously match posture, speech rhythm, facial expression. But digital mirroring operates with a precision that physical mirroring cannot match, because text leaves a record. You can scroll back and watch yourself becoming someone else in real time. Watch the moment your language shifted. Watch yourself reaching for their vocabulary because your own suddenly felt insufficient. It is one of the most human things you can do through a screen, and one of the most invisible. This is syntax as a mirror. Not of how you write, but of how you feel, of how safe you feel, of how seen you feel, of how much power you believe you hold in the conversation you are having, and how much you believe you do not. Every qualifier, every over-explanation, every fragmented burst of rapid-fire messages, every borrowed word from someone whose approval you were quietly trying to earn. They were all there, in every thread you have ever had, and you wrote them without knowing you were writing a confession.
I want to be honest with you about something. When I first went down this rabbit hole, when I first started really looking at the research behind digital communication, behind the way we text and what it reveals, my first reaction wasn't fascination, it was anger. Because I started thinking about every conversation I'd had through a screen, not knowing any of this. Every message I sent that was soaked in anxiety, I couldn't name. Every time I over-explained something that needed one sentence, every time I added just to a request I had every right to make without apologizing for it. Every time I replied too fast and handed someone a metric of my availability I never consciously agreed to share. I didn't know, and the harder truth, the one that took me a little longer to sit with, is that other people did know. Maybe not academically, maybe not with the language we've been using today, but intuitively, experientially, they had figured out, through their own navigation of this landscape, that timing was leverage, that a reaction was a signal, that a read receipt was a choice. And they use that knowledge in relationships, in negotiations, in the small daily power dynamics that we pretend don't exist, but that shape everything. But here is where I want to land before we go into the final section. Knowledge is not the same as manipulation. Understanding how these signals work does not mean you have to start gaming them. It does not mean you have to become someone who weaponizes response time or engineers their emoji choices for maximum psychological effect. What it means, what it can mean if you choose, is that you finally get to be intentional. That for the first time, the message you mean to send and the message you actually send have a chance of being the same thing. That gap between intention and transmission is what we've been mapping this whole time. And in the last section, we're going to talk about how to close it.
Everything we have covered until now has been diagnosis. The grammar that signals your status without your permission. The timing that broadcasts your availability whether you intend it to or not. The reactions and receipts that speak louder than the words around them. The syntax that confesses your anxiety before your conscious mind has decided what to reveal. All of it happening beneath the surface, all of it running on automatic. But automaticity is not destiny. And awareness, real awareness, the kind that comes from understanding a system rather than just feeling its effects, is the first and most powerful tool of change. So the question is not whether these signals exist. They do. The question is what you choose to do now that you can see them. The first practice is the one that requires the most honesty. It is the audit. Go back through your recent conversations, not to judge yourself. Judgment is not the point, and it is not useful here, but to observe. To look at your own digital footprint with the same clinical detachment a researcher would bring to a subject they have never met. Notice where the justs appear. Notice which conversations produce the fragmented bursts and which produce the composed single message. Notice the threads where your response time is fast and the ones where you make people wait. And ask yourself honestly what those patterns say about how you have distributed your attention and your regard. Because your threads are a map, and maps, once you know how to read them, tell you exactly where you have been. And more importantly, they tell you where you have been without meaning to go. The second practice is what communication researchers have begun calling strategic silence. And it is almost certainly the most misunderstood tool in digital communication. Strategic silence is not an avoidance. It is not the cold weaponization of response latency that we explored earlier. The calculated withholding designed to make someone feel their own smallness. That is a different thing entirely, and it belongs to a different conversation about a different kind of person. Strategic silence is something quieter and more disciplined. It is the practice of responding from a place of readiness rather than reactivity, of allowing a message to exist in your awareness for long enough that your reply comes from your center rather than your nervous system, of understanding that the pause between receiving and responding is not dead time. It is processing time, thinking time, a space in which the quality of everything you send is determined. The people who communicate with the most clarity and authority are almost never the fastest responders in the room. They are the most deliberate ones. The third practice is the one that will feel most uncomfortable at first, because it requires you to trust that your unadorned words are enough. Remove one qualifier from every message you send today. Just one. Take out the just. Take out the sorry to bother you. Take out the exclamation point you added, not because you were excited, but because you were afraid of being misread. Send the message without the armor, and notice what happens. Not in the reply you receive, though that may surprise you too, but in yourself. in the moment after you hit send without the cushioning, the vulnerability of it, the exposure. And then, underneath that, something else. Something that might take a few attempts before you can name it clearly. Relief. Because the exhausting thing about performing nonchalance, about inflating punctuation to manage perception, about preempting judgment with qualifiers and apologies, is that it never actually protects you. It just makes you smaller. And it costs you something every single time you do it. And finally, the frontier that sits just beyond the edge of what we can currently measure, but that researchers in behavioral AI and natural language processing are moving toward with remarkable speed. The possibility of real-time tone analysis, of technology that reads not just what you are saying, but what your syntax is broadcasting beneath the words. That flags the anxiety pattern before you send it. That reflects your digital body language back to you before it leaves your hands. It is coming. And when it arrives, it will do for digital communication what the mirror did for physical self-presentation. It will make the invisible visible. It will close the gap between the person you were trying to be in a conversation and the person your nervous system keeps transmitting without your consent. But until that day, and perhaps more valuably than that day, there is something the algorithm will never replace. Something that no tone analyzer, however sophisticated, can fully replicate. Human intuition, the felt sense of a conversation, the thing in you that already knew before you had any of this language that the period was wrong, and the silence was too long, and the thumbs up where a heart should have been meant something real. You already knew. You just didn't have the framework to trust it. You have always been reading this language. You just never had permission to believe what you were reading. Now you do. Every day, billions of messages leave billions of hands and travel through billions of screens, words chosen and unchosen, punctuation placed and withheld, replies sent in seconds and replies held for hours, reactions given and reactions deliberately, carefully not given. A civilization communicating at a scale and a speed that has no precedent in human history. And almost none of it consciously understood. The period that closed a door, the lowercase that performed indifference, the three dots that appeared and disappeared and left someone alone with a question that kept them awake, the voice note that offered something real and the thumbs up that received it as though it were nothing, the just that shrank a person who had every right to stand at full height, the reply that came 4 hours late and said everything about hierarchy without saying a single word about it. These are not small things. They are the texture of modern intimacy, the fabric of how trust is built and eroded, how power is established and surrendered, how connection is offered and either received or quietly, devastatingly declined. All through a screen, all through a device that fits in your pocket, all in the spaces between the words that everyone can see and the signals that almost no one was taught to read. You were not given a manual for this. None of us were. We were handed the most psychologically complex communication environment in the history of our species and told, implicitly, to work it out as we went, to absorb the rules through trial and error, and the accumulated small humiliations of being misread and misreading others, of sending the wrong signal at the wrong moment and never quite understanding why the temperature of something changed. That was never acceptable, and naming it, clearly, directly, without softening the edges of it, matters. Because the gap between what we intend to communicate and what we actually transmit is not a personal failing. It is a structural one, a gap that exists because no one built the bridge. But you are standing on one side of that gap now with something you did not have before. Language. And language, real language, the kind that names what was previously only felt, is where every form of literacy begins. It is how the invisible becomes visible, how the automatic becomes chosen, how the person you have been in your digital life and the person you mean to be finally begin to move toward each other. You have been sending signals your entire digital life. For the first time, you know what they mean.